So you might notice here that Ableton went ahead and mapped a bunch of these Serum parameters to the VST window. This is only because I'm recording this all for the tutorial, so I'll have to remember to delete all these mappings, because I have a specific way I map Serum's parameters to the VST window and then into the 8 macro controls of Ableton's instrument racks. So if you remember when we started with this preset, the LFO was doing all the work. But then we kind of gave the LFO the cold shoulder while we were working on the envelope 2 and macro 1 there. So we're going to welcome back the LFO, and we're going to change the mode to trigger, and then we're going to change it to a shape that I have saved in the user folder for LFOs. And this is a shape that I've found works well for live playing, so that when you press a key down, it gives you those whoop-whoops in a predictable way with more or less predictable timing that you can of course speed up and slow down with the rate parameter. And you can copy this LFO shape just by looking at it here, and then save it to your user folder. So how do we set this up so that we don't have to keep deactivating and reactivating the LFO parameters? Because now that we have an envelope as well and a direct macro, I guarantee you're sometimes going to want the LFO and you're sometimes not going to want it. So what we'll do is set up an auxiliary source for all of the LFO mappings. And we'll use macro 2. There we go. Count it up, make sure I got 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Whoops, one too many. And now we're going to adjust the curves, and I'm going to make them pretty steep, making sure they're all at -60, so that the LFO only really comes into effect when macro 2 is all the way over to the right. As we'll see shortly, this is going to allow macro 2 to serve other functions as well. Let's test it out. I'm going to play some keys, and I'm going to dial in the LFO by twisting macro 2 to the right. And then I'm going to adjust the rate of the LFO. Oh, let's make sure we get rid of this anchor function, because it's going to start the LFO at the beginning of the cycle every time I change it to a different speed. We want the LFO to reset every time I hit a new key on the keyboard. We don't want it to reset when I change the rate. So the LFO is working great, but we're hearing the effects of the LFO and the envelope at the same time right now, and it's a bit much. As we're going to see shortly, macro 2's job is going to be switching between the LFO modulating things and the envelope modulating things. So when we're finished here, the LFO and the envelope are never going to be working at the exact same time. So we're actually going to have to bend over backwards to be able to do this, because with Serum, you can't have a modulation of a modulation of a modulation. You can have modulation of a modulation. That's what that column there is that says aux source. But you can't have the third level modulation the way you can with some other synths, like Alchemy, for example. So what I wish I would have been able to do is set up macro 2 as the aux source also for the envelope. And at that point I would have just had to curve it the opposite way and then invert the modulation direction. And then macro 2 would have been this wonderful single knob where to the very left I hear the envelope doing its work, and to the very right I hear the LFO doing its work, and in the middle, because of our steep curves, neither the envelope or the LFO is doing anything, so I can use the direct macro. But unfortunately I can't do it this way because our aux source for envelope 2 is already being taken up. It's already taken by velocity. So I've developed a workaround for this, and it might be different for you depending on whether you've got Ableton or another piece of software. And the workaround is to take these output sliders and turn them down when the LFO is doing its thing, because you can map these to the macros of Ableton's instrument rack.